Hello and welcome to Eclectic Spacewalk Conversations. I'm your host, Nicholas McKay. Today we are joined by Brent Cooper. Brent is an independent political sociologist, filmmaker, and the founder and executive director of the Abs-Tract Organization. Welcome to Conversations, Brent.
Thanks for having me.
So first off, Brent, where did you grow up? Let's get a little bit about your background.
Okay, I grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is, where people like Seth Rogen and Ryan Reynolds are from.
Sure.
BC
Bud.
Yeah, BC Bud, yeah. I'm 38. I'm an older millennial. And so, you asked me to give a bit of sort of history and backstory. And sometimes I like to start with something light, like 9/11.
Okay, yeah, sure.
I think I was like 18, right, when that happened. So it was pretty formative, like, wow, what the fuck's happening? This
Sure.
is like theatrical terrorism, deep states, war on terror, all this stuff unfolded. And prior to that, I was very interested in these types of things as a naive teenager, liked shows like the X-Files and 24 for a little bit. I'm very ashamed of the fact that I used to watch that show.
Jack Bauer was your boy. Yeah.
But it's just a guilty pleasure, right? Never
Sure.
anything more. But sort of just really interested in and committed to understanding politics.
Mm-hmm.
From that time. And I was a late bloomer. I didn't go to university until five years after high school, which was 5 years after 9/11, and focused on political science, sociology, eventually majored in international relations, and then mastered in political sociology. And really, I was lucky as a student because I, was not indoctrinated in social justice or any of that type of those type of tropes about university, but I had very good teachers and I studied exactly what I wanted. So it led me to the tough questions, the paradoxes and the contradictions between different theories, and kind of on that track to become an academic, because what else can you do? Right. I learned that 90% of sociologists became teachers, became professors. And that didn't sit well with me, because I would, I wanted to see, and I think the world would be better off to have more sociologists, but more in different places too, more in the media, more in think tanks, more in various capacities. So I was burnt out by the end of 2011 and decided not to pursue a PhD. Or at least to take a break and work for a bit. Mm-hmm. I never did end up really getting sustained work in the field, because, as I just said, 90% of sociologists just teach. So there's not a whole lot of opportunities, but that's kind of the reason I chose it, is like, let's do something novel, niche, needed. And I think it's desperately needed today. So it's kind of like, out in the wilderness, but it's through connections like this, like with you and others, and the different colleagues we have that overlap, where a lot of interesting work is being done.
Right. And so when you were growing up, I mean, what were kind of your biggest influence? You said at some point in time, the arts, like with shows and stuff, but like bring us back to like when you were curious, like, I mean, not to get to like what were you doing when you grew up, but like, what were some of the books or the thinkers or the influences before you might have changed them when you went to university, academia, et cetera?
Yeah, it was definitely comedians and comics. People like George Conlon, for example, because he was, or Bill Hicks is a great example too, because they're doing a kind of social critique and analysis within the comedy. So I was getting a lot of my education through that. I also think I consumed a lot more documentaries than I did books. So it was hard, to find intellectual role models. Mm-hmm. But they're certainly out there, and I think it was through comedy, especially in my youth in the 90s, that was so formative in kind of figuring out what's true and what's worth philosophizing about. So yeah, I when I try to think back to being a kid, who my intellectual role models are, it's it's hard. I mean, I could.
I mean, the
go to
comedians are
somebody-
great though, because
Yeah.
like you said, like the social commentary. I mean, I think any one of us would love to be on stage and telling jokes and getting laughed at. You know, I think that's one thing that everyone has thought about at one time or the other. And anytime that I thought about it, it was not me like going up there like doing knee slappers. It was like, you know, doing you know, social commentary. You know, Bill Hicks, and then even more so that you can really press the stuff with George Carlin when he did the, you know, the bad words and stuff like that. Like, I mean, that changed a kind of generation to, you know, what if that didn't happen? You know, one of our futures could be that like we'd still be in like language police territory, that curse words were outlawed, you know, by death or something, you know. And it's like, well, we went this way, that at least that, you know, it was pushed on and stuff like that. So I mean, I do agree with those two examples though.
Yeah, we have kind of the reverse happening today anyways. You know, you have a lot of people that identify as conservative comedians, right? Who are not funny, and who are always complaining about being censored one way or another.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Well, here, let's talk about you know, let's just get through your kind of academic journey. So, and I don't mean to ask, but it kind of came up when you started talking that you had about a 5-year break in between. Were you just kind of living it? Were you just hanging out? Like, were you enjoying life?
No, I not really. I was grinding away in a blue collar job, and so that is a formative part of my identity anyways, and outlook. So as an intellectual, I want to represent, you know, the common struggle, which is actually still pretty far removed from my experience. But nevertheless, I want to advocate for a more equitable society, and post-capitalist really is the best sort of catch-all term for that. But yeah, for 5 years, I kind of did nothing for 2 of those years. Okay. on the front and the back of working for 3 years in what would you call it? I worked, it's not just blue collar. I worked like a roughneck job.
Oh, okay.
And I worked on tugboats, with logs, with log booms. So I say that because it's kind of in a way adjacent to all the other natural resource sectors like mining or oil, in the sense that if you want to, I don't know how it is today, but I think there's always been quite a high demand and quite high pay for those jobs. And in many cases, they're dangerous jobs. So they should pay a lot.
Right.
But during that time, you know, I remember I was reading books like Gwyn Dyer's Future Tense, you know, so I was reading about the Iraq War, just trying to understand and trying to have a global perspective. And so I was only working because I didn't know at that point still how to go to university. That's why, I say, I'm a late bloomer. It took me 5 years to kind of figure it out. But by the time I did, I was quite a good student. Like, I was not a good student in high school, but university, especially what I studied, it was just so enriching and really radicalizing in a way. Like, if you start, you do media studies or feminist studies or Marxism or whatever you do, it's going to open your eyes a bit and give you the conceptual footing you need to really take on these different power structures and stuff like that. So also part of my journey, because of the timing, was grappling with the waning of postmodernism, right? Which started in the 90s, but really by the mid 2000s, it was, you know, there was, what was being taught wasn't the complete picture. It was like the best a given professor had in terms of their curriculum, right? So I had to like do a lot of self-directed research,
right,
to get ahead in that regard. And that's what's led me on this path. And so, you know, post 2011, 2012, and especially since starting the Abstract project around 2013, 2014, and really formalizing it more in late 2016, early 2017, is just to continually synthesize all these different threads, different research fields, different special interests, all in the context of, globalization within our lifetimes, look, what is the change we're seeing happening over a 30-year period? There's something novel from all of history, something that even the best and brightest of the elites have to admit that there's a sort of meta crisis that they can't articulate, or that they certainly can't solve.
Right. And I think one of the biggest things that sums that up, that we get to the bare bone, or the bare bedrock, is like, just when we really look to scientists, when they say we're in an Anthropocene, we're in a different, geological record. And it's like, well, you can't really refute like geological time over something. Like, we're doing something of some ways. And so like to I guess ground ourselves in that we're living in the Anthropocene, like that alone should ground us in how we look about life, how we deal with cultures and things. But then I guess this would be a good time to, I guess, introduce people to the concept of kind of meta-modernism, and then versus, which you've kind of brought up in some of your writing, is hyper-modernism. And so I guess like maybe we should just like distinguish between that. It's kind of like different techno futures. Like we're going along these one paths, and we take different paths of our history behind us, and we kind of project them into our future and our present. But like which way we go in that techno future is kind of distinct on how we critique it, how we be honest in our language about it, who we fund and give credence to. So I guess like let's just kind of unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll try to give a crash course on my version of meta-modernism, because it starts at the end of the Cold War.
Okay.
And as you may know, I only came across this research later, but Albert Borgman sort of developed a theory way before it was cool. He's writing in 1989 at a conference with a bunch of other people, right? So the whole conference proceedings are quite interesting, but Borgman is basically formulating a schism in postmodernism, recognizing that the culture is waning, that there's some sort of transition happening. And he named it as a bifurcation into meta-modernism and hypermodernism. And so that was kind of lost academically, right? That was kind of forgotten. And even Borgman himself kind of didn't use that language further. He continued to write and write about things like American democracy, but without those terms. And so I think it was a missed opportunity, both by him and by everybody else, to not recognize these contributions, not to formalize it more, because that's exactly what happened 20 years later, right? With you have postmodernisms emerging, various names, about a dozen different terms to go beyond postmodernism, and then Vermeulen and Van den Acker, formalizing it, not including Borgman in that synthesis, whether it was conscious or just accidental. And various other authors, right? Gonzalez and Okadiji, I think is his name. So there's all these sort of prescient, kind of emergent discourses that I tried to synthesize later as all these other things are coming online. And of course, Hansi Freinacht kind of presents himself as an embodiment of these artistic metamodern values and cultural critiques that are already extant at that point. So to this day, it's kind of a mishmash of all of that. As we speak, there's supposed to be a book coming out from Perspectiva Press, which I have a chapter in. That's supposed to come out this month. It's pretty late in the month now. Maybe it's not going to happen.
Okay.
But that's a full-on book that has been in the works for a few years now, to kind of draw together some of these questions and authors and meta problems.
Are you familiar with Timothy Morton's work?
Mm,
Like dark objects, or I
mm,
mean hyper objects. Sorry, and dark
mm,
ecology. I
mm,
mean, like nothing says. And Jeremy Johnson, one of we did another podcast with him, and we talked a little bit about this, how COVID is a great example of like a hyper object. It just pulls you in everything single direction. It just wants energy basically, in itself. And climate change is another way. Like, it's entwined in almost everything that we can think of. And the only way to really think of it is through that, like, entwinement, that abstraction and stuff. And we'll get more into that. But like, I mean, I think, that is some of the interesting, more descriptors, of our age. And so I don't know if you have any other ones that kind of go along those lines. But I think, Timothy Morton's, hyperobjects and kind of dark ecology, it kind of flirts with the same things.
yeah. So Vermeulen and Vandenacker's work includes speculative realism,
Okay.
and triple O, what
Right,
you're
right, right.
talking
Exactly.
about as part of metamodernism. And we can say, okay, that's fine, because I find a lot of value in the hyperobject concept too. Obviously, climate change is the best example, but the military-industrial complex, I think
Great
people really need
example.
to understand when they invoke that term, they're
Yeah.
talking about something very huge and irreducible, and so many moving parts. Like,
Good point.
even people within it are disoriented, or just caught up in some sort of ideology. So I don't think
Very
that's
Stockholm syndrome through the entire society. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like, yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that definitely links to hypermodernism. But what I was
Sure.
going to say is I have reservations only because the modern monetary theory crowd, who I follow quite closely, they kind of disregard and reject speculative realism and speculative materialisms, and that kind of thing. And I'm still trying to grapple with what the complete argument
Well,
is for
yeah. How so?
that
Because like,
divergence.
as I understand it, that's basically like, we can just print as much money as we want. It's like it doesn't really matter like what infrastructure kind of things we need. We just need to get it done. And so because before, in the last couple decades, it was, we can't do this. Oh my God, we're gonna debt deficits, all this other stuff. And then now this new theory's come out and said, no, like spend your way into like prosperity, and so like I don't
Yeah.
know if you can critique that, but like kind of maybe synergize those two things for the listeners.
Yeah, so MMT is becoming more salient and credible as a public discourse about public money. How money can be spent and mobilized for public goods, and that, in its essence, is something that's always resonated with me since being a kid. Like, you look around as a kid, and there's lots of adult dysfunction that you can point out and understand, and be like, why
Absolutely.
is the world this way? Like. And there's lots of reasons that becomes path dependent and entrenched, but yeah, you can kind of, without being naive or magical about it, you can imagine just less military spending and more spending on public infrastructure, right? And that's not
Sure.
you don't even need to go into MMT to make that argument. But when it comes to how they're at odds with the metamodernists or speculative realists, it's a lot to do with kind of the how they orient to the aesthetics of modernity, right? Whether that's just the way kind of cities are organized, or big budget movies are made,
Good point.
tentpole movies. So they have a
Yep.
really interesting kind of reinvigoration of critical theory that I think maybe the speculative realists aren't even attempting.
Right. Right.
And so there's a kind of revival there, and I'm down with it, because it it directly kind of the MMTers are also vocal about advocacy for queer stuff. They say money is queer, in fact, and therefore Black Lives Matter just as much as critical race theory, right? And so these concepts have become like punching bags for the right.
Oh yeah, sure. Good.
And also just things I think objects that a lot of these theorists might distance themselves from. Right. So it creates a tension there. So what I guess I might not be able to unpack all the intricacies of these conflicts, but at the end of the day, it lends to a kind of autocritique and skepticism of philosophical work itself. So, I mean, to get into a position where you're problematizing Timothy Morton, whatever he's doing, that's a very hypercritical view. And if it's like, I just want to be on board with it if it's accurate.
Sure,
you know.
Sure.
So we're drawn to kind of a truth attractor wherever it might be, because I do believe that our fate when it comes to like logistically dealing with climate change depends on some sort of meta theoretical convergence and new sort of language emerging that more people can understand each other.
Right. So way more in a cooperative vein in a lot of different abstract levels, like you said, in language and like even just how logistics happen. That's interesting. I want to kind of pull in some threads. You said you kind of did some roughneck work and stuff, and we were just talking about problems and problematizing and things like that, and then truth. And one of the concepts I think you'll know, or as a heuristic that I like, and we can maybe get into more heuristics in this juncture, is key logs. And so it's like the idea of a key log is, back in the old time, they would throw these big trees down the river, and it would go from point A to point B where the mill is, and they'd saw them up. But sometimes there'd be too many logs that basically would get in and get all crumpled up and stop and make like an artificial dam. And then these dudes that were specialty key loggers, they would go and then like get, this is one of the most dangerous jobs, I guess, probably in the history. You know what I mean? Like basically go on a floating wooden thing, and then you have to identify which one is like the crux point, the key log, that if you move that key log, then the entire thing, it's basically the most efficient way to undo a backup. Whatever the most lowest kind of like denominator is. And obviously there could be multiple key logs. We're not getting into that, but like a key log is that like, that's one thing that you can just pop, and then it just kind of pops out. So I kind of want to look into that. Like let's I guess unpack is that there is a log there. And a lot of people, there's industries that packed up that like tell people that there's not a backup. In the river, there's industry, and so let's talk about a little bit about truth and maybe some of that like merchants of doubt, because we just talked about a hyperobject in the military-industrial complex, and one of the things that you just talked about in speculative realism and stuff is like, or I guess adjacent is the manufacturing consent, is that like all these military and people, they have first say on all these movies that are coming out to literally then make the public discourse be in that viewpoint. Hurt Locker, Black Hawk Down, very U.S. centric, etc. Films, and then you automatically have almost a zeitgeist ideology coming forth from that is not truthful. So I mean, let's maybe unpack some of those things. And I don't know if you had heard the keylog thing, but that's kind of one of the biggest heuristics that I've been looking at recently.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with the terminology, so that's interesting. Because I mean, I never had to do any of that, because what you're referring to is when they did send it down the river.
Sure, yeah.
Freestyle, which is crazy, but that's our ancestors.
That's our history, Brent.
Exactly,
wild people doing.
Yeah, I mean, we can't even imagine the mega construction projects of the past and all the manual labor. But I didn't know the term keylog, but it's analogous to I think it's called a keystone. When you're building an arch, and the keystone is the last one you put in place that holds it together. And if you were to take that out, it would fall. So where to go with that?
Well, I mean, it's just like we were talking about, the military industrial complex, like we were talking about, hyperobjects, and something that's like basically permeating through society, it can have its own like will, and I just wrote an essay called Technopoly, that basically talks about Neil Postman's book and how technology, really has a mind of its own, and, us being the inventors really, even though we made it, we're not the best judge if it's good or bad and sad and how it's used and this. And then honestly, you can get to the point where, fossil fuel or what, maybe not a demarcation of that, but like you can get to another hyperobject that could mess the planet up and cause human extinction. And then right here, some of that hyperobject may be even, polluting the discourse to then even let it happen, that we are none the wiser, and that's kind of like climate change in a nutshell, and merchants of doubt and Exxon and that kind of stuff. So just trying to, public truth and discourse, I was just trying to maybe riff on those kind of things.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, in the news on a regular basis, alternative news, but Steve Donziger is a lawyer who went after Chevron.
And yes, I have been seeing this case. Yes.
He's been under house arrest for like 2 years or something. And I remember listening to him on like Democracy Now! Like 4 or 5 years ago, and just thinking like, this is the real shit. Like this is a guy whose career it is to really embed himself in networks of resistance to capitalism and change. And what I noticed though was that even back then, the story wasn't getting enough support and credit, right? You only hear about it through outlets like Democracy Now! But so there's that, but also just in response to everything else you're saying about how saturated we are with military culture, like it's so overdetermined, right? And there's so many assumptions baked into these different film projects like Zero Dark 30 or whatever it is. but to kind of play devil's advocate, what pops into my head is, I think his name's Mark Milley. He's like a American general. It's kind of went viral in the last couple of days because he made some positive comments kind of with regard to critical race theory and that whole moral panic, right? The whole right-wing hysteria, to call it what it is. Here you have a general, he's like, on the face of it, like not particularly political, but recognizes the intellectual aspect that is prefigurative of war. Right. So here's a guy who, listening to him, you can tell he's reasonable and actually wants to avoid war, right? Which is not, I don't think he's the norm in the military industrial complex. I think he's an outlier who, thank God, has been very successful, right? And has sort of risen the ranks. But you need more people like that, because
well, he said it was one of the biggest things is he said that he needed to be well read. I think it was operational awareness or situational awareness was the key word he used. And it's like, he's not like, regardless, let's just take it even from his most like objective stance. Like, don't even give him, let's have the most skepticism and the most criticism that he wants to go bloodthirsty, kill everyone. It's like, even at that level, you want to understand what the fuck is going on. You know what I mean? And it's like, what is going on inside your ranks? What is going on in the outside culture? What is going on? And things. And it's like the fact that he's taking an intellectual humility of that he does not know everything. That alone is, I think, the biggest thing, because all these other people are saying, no, I know this. And the thing that I am pushing knows it, and it's only right. And it's like the fact that he's saying, hey, I don't know everything, and I need to be well read, and I need to understand even things like Mao Zedong and, all this other stuff. And I'm not that, like, it's like, oh wait, that gets more on the intelligent side, the more coherent side. And like what you were talking about, muddying the waters. It's like, there's been a lot of, incoherence, and the fact that you find some coherence with just, basic common sense stuff of like having some intellectual humility, learning and steel manning your own arguments by learning about what you're going up against. It's like, that's just basic debate tactics. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to get too crazy, even military awareness. So like, even the fact that of that is an interesting thing, that you bring up. So Mark Milley, kudos to him. Interesting. Do you have any other favorite heuristics? I mentioned the keylog in my ebook, Tripping Over the Truth. Kind of having your own heuristics or having your own biases and then tripping over them, having them put forth in front of you. Do you have any other heuristics that you kind of love?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Before the call, you mentioned my film. And you said you watched it and you're a fan, and that's great, because otherwise I can't invoke these things, right? But in the film, there's a fair bit about heuristics. Yep. And there's even a scene where the protagonist literally trips in the forest. He trips over a root, and the idea there was that he was taking a self-administered acid test, right? So he was doing LSD and doing some self-exploration, running through the forest, trips over a root. So it's like a very on-the-nose visual metaphor for this. And after that point in the film, he has realizations. He kind of starts to have one epiphany after another. And earlier in the film, there's a bit about heuristics too. And the example I use actually is standing desks. And this is totally off topic, but I'm just using it as an example because, set it and forget it is a kind of catchphrase. Yeah.
I do that to my girlfriend all the time. I'm like, set it and forget it. And she had never seen those commercials. And it's like, that is hilarious that you just said that. Like, oh my God, that's
funny. So we all operate on heuristics all the time, partially without even knowing it. And so it's so critical to know and to try to iterate on your heuristics. And of course, the point I'm making there with the film is that drugs can facilitate that. But also, philosophy itself. If you're serious about a philosophical pursuit, you'll come to those same questions and answers regardless. But nothing off the top of my head in terms of what heuristics lately are the most functional.
Right. No, that's good. But like, then maybe let's move from heuristics to one of the videos that you did with the Stoa, which was great. You went into kind of this, and we can get into some of these other things, but I want to key in on the 5 logical fallacies. You brought up some other stuff, and so now we're kind of vaguely getting into this intellectualism, anti-intellectualism, and so maybe I think the heuristics is a good segue into these 5 logical fallacies. Maybe we can go through each one very quickly and then kind of give a good example. But willful ignorance, whataboutism, contrarianism, denialism, and self-deception. So like willfully ignorant, like I think that's almost like a de facto like cultural thing, is that now we've bred a culture of willfully ignorant people, and then that has downstream effects and stuff like that. And we were just kind of talking on that. So I guess that'll be a good starting point.
Yeah, actually those are perfect examples of heuristics for the purposes we're talking about,
right.
Intellectualism, reflexivity. And a lot of that comes from, I'll just say like the new atheism movement, right, kind of popularized a lot of that rationalism. And like a lot of people, I was part of that at the time.
Sure.
As you said you wanted to like go into IDW and Game B territory, and as it relates to the Stoa in my talk, like all of this stuff is connected.
Sure.
And so, my point in that article was partly to, very quickly retread some of the old rationalism that's come before, to distinguish between, what's true and what's not true. And the problem is you see the IDW committing a lot of those fallacies, like whataboutism or willful ignorance. And a lot of the discourse around the intellectual dark web has been very divisive, right? So you have the critics, and then you have them really having a lot of hegemony in public discourse. But I think it's so hard to pin down what is intellectual at the end of the day. That was part of what I was getting at.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, the IDW is such a clear-cut case. If you look at it objectively, if you're not deeply involved or committed to it, you can see the kind of hypocrisies manifesting. Like they're first and foremost kind of free speech advocates, but then they're literally trying to silence activists and critics and teachers even that are trying to teach critical thinking, critical approaches to things. Which so nothing today, because it's salient, nothing is more anti-intellectual than this reaction to critical race theory.
Right. I mean, even recently, did you see DeSantis, the governor of Florida, just signed the bill, basically like you have to basically say what your political leanings are. And it's like, whether that's constitutional or not, whether that's like whatever, it's like, that is hilarious and ironic. The fact that these free speech advocates, that this should be the rallying cry of rallying cries. If you were like had the coherence of the argument that you've been putting forth, but then that's what we get to the discourse of like, well then is it just more education on more and more people seeing these things than being able to call them out? Because it just seems like they're still doing it because they can do it, because there's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of, prestige, power, etc. Because these aren't people that are just, off the block. I mean, Jordan Peterson, he has a following. Sam Harris has a following. Joe Rogan, all these people have a following, so.
And Steven Crowder has a huge following.
Yeah.
And I
and
bring
that
him
debate
up.
with Sam Cedar. Oh my God, what is going on? Yeah.
Yeah. and so a point I want to drive home along these lines is that, very much a lot of what we validate or behold as public discourse is not actually like transparent. It's not talking about the thing it thinks it's talking about. Right. So all of the hysteria around critical race theory, that's not what it's about. It's about something else. And so the best heuristic takes of that are not to oversimplify, but the best takes are like, well, this is really just a manifestation of deep kind of racial inequality and anxiety around racism and talking about racism, nothing new. Right. Yeah. But that while that's true, that doesn't get through to anybody. It's not received as a persuasive argument. And I mentioned Crowder because it's on my mind, and he does have a huge following. But it's so interesting. I watched Majority Report and Crowder in the days after, kind of looking at how both sides reflected and what the fallout was, right? And they're basically saying the same thing about each other.
I can imagine so. I can imagine
the exact same thing.
This guy did this, that guy did that.
Yeah,
this is
and
bullshit.
So it's frustrating. I have a good time laughing at it, but that's fundamentally not what I want, right?
No,
so
exactly. This is unproductive as shit. Like, come on, guys.
And so anyone who has that approach is kind of left out in the cold too, because
that's funny.
How do you intervene? How do you talk about it? And so coming back to the point of like, again, most of what passes for public discourse, whether it's coming from the New York Times or a think tank, is not about the thing. It's not about what people think it's about. And so I realized a long time ago, I think, just how captured and carried we can be by different discourses, different job opportunities, sort of like socio-ecological niches to live and thrive in, right? And that's
look at Glenn Greenwald. I mean, he's the poster child of this, I think, in my eyes, as someone that, like, you broke the Snowden story. Oh my gosh, you are the paragon of free speech and, all this stuff, holding truth to power. And then now it's like, you have you literally, I watch what you do, and you just play fights and but pick fights to just make into this either or thing, which you were just talking about. Another Steven Crowder example, all these other people. So it's interesting that these guys get passed off as this like domain of yes or no, right or wrong, red or blue, all these dichotomies. And that's, I think, maybe one of the other parts of the discourse is that, like, the fact that we're not seeing both in this, like, I mean, I'm not saying both. I don't want to get into the centrism and what, bothism and stuff like that. But at the same time, on some issues, there are ways to go about it, you know, and the being honest about it. I mean, Steven Crowder is known for saying, change my mind. And it's like, I want to know, has anyone done like a study, like a real study of how many times he has actually changed his mind? Because it's like, and if it's not more times than you haven't, then this isn't interesting. You know what I mean? Because it's like all the times that you haven't changed your mind, it's like, well, welcome to the fucking club of humanity, man. Like you're no better than anyone. But then you have a platform saying that you know something and do something different. It's like, I'm not sitting on my high horse saying this either, but like a little bit of, you know, intellectual humility is the first step. So.
Yeah, exactly. And so I had wished that an actual sort of debate or interview took place between Cedar and Crowder, or Ethan, and, you know, that they all just got over the surprise and the joke of it, and actually tried to accomplish something. Because when you look at how they reported on it after the fact, for both of them, they both said that they had the desire to have an actual debate or interview. So they were both accusing each other of bad faith. And to be clear, I mean, you know, it's not equal. Sam Cedar is absolutely more legitimate, more in the right, you know, but there is a critical way to view it, that they both failed to kind of live up to their own ideals of wanting an authentic exchange. And
but then Steven Crowder, but isn't that Ethan guy, like, he's a comic, right? So again, it's like you alone, you're saying that I'm this intellectual heavyweight and I'm gonna go fight a child. You know what I mean? It's like, wait, what? Like, and then they bring in an actual fighter, and then the child goes, "Hey, now you get to fight him." Like, that's how I saw it. It was like more of like leveling the playing field, because like Steven Crowder, he's not like unintelligent. Like, that's not. No one's saying that. You know what I mean? Like, he knows what he's doing. But yeah, like the biggest thing I think for me is when I had any interest in the IDW kind of world was watching that debate. With Zizek, Slavoj Zizek and Jordan Peterson. And I like watched it, like I was excited, and then I'm sitting there, and then it's within the first minute, you know, the first opening paragraph, you know, his opening statement, he's basically like, well, this is the first time I'm actually reading it. And it's like, well, wait a second. I've just been listening to you on Joe Rogan and all these other people for a year talk about this, that, and other, and you have been decrying it, and you haven't even read the source material. And it was like, oh my gosh, like, yes, even those people, the highest of the high of public, you know, intelligentsia intellectuals, won't even do the most basic common sense thing to even have it. And it's like, that blew my mind. And if that's what's happening in the current stage, I just started thinking about all the other previous and the past, and I was like, oh, whoa, don't, that's black holes. But let's keep on like the IDW and stuff like that, and maybe the debate with Zizek of something like two heavyweights actually coming up against each other, and one clearly not doing the homework, you know?
Yeah, that was very revelatory. And I kind of knew before, you know, it didn't surprise me at all. What did surprise me was actually the admission, you know, the way Peterson went up there, and his opening statement was like, well, I've only read one of Marx's books, and I read it 20 years ago, and, you know, here we go. I was like, what? But I knew at the same time that wasn't going to change much, because even though a lot of leftists say like, yeah, Zizek won, you know, kind of mopped the floor with Peterson, or Peterson embarrassed himself, like, there was a kind of, you know, measurable change in the temperature of the public discourse or whatever, but nothing fundamentally changed, right? What you had was a lot of Peterson defenders kind of ceding at one point, ceding some territory and being like, okay, yeah, he's kind of wrong about Marxism, but I'm still pro-capitalist.
Right.
You know, so really nothing changed. And yeah.
Is that the same critique then? Maybe this is a good segue into like Game B. You know, is that kind of the same critique of Game B? Is that like, well, that's an interesting framing, and then maybe you can kind of set it up and stuff, but then it hasn't really had the impact that maybe the framework itself is kind of saying that it should, and then we kind of agree that it should, but then it's not. So then maybe there's some critiques that need to happen fundamentally.
Yeah. So moving to game B. It's interesting because I got the chance a couple months ago to have like an anti-debate with Jordan Hall.
Okay.
So that's on the Stoa for their patrons. But
I did listen to your thing with Jim Rutt as well, and like you started pointing back a little, and he was like, "Oh, we're not gonna go."
Yeah.
But no, I mean, it was a. I at least applaud him. Maybe not some other of the Game B people. At least he gave you at least a platform, talked with you, etc. I don't know exactly your experience on that, but for me as an outsider, it seemed like he was at least wanting to dialogue at some level. So.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that too, but we'll get to that point after this one. So Peter Lindbergh has this idea of an anti-debate, and it's so interesting because watching Crowder the other day, watching his sort of debrief the day after, Crowder literally used the word anti-debate. Crowder literally said, "What debates, are polarizing. I don't want to have these dunking contests." Like, he was sounding really mature and sort of sincere. And I'll sort of give a bit of credit where if it's true. But anyways, Crowder used those terms, anti-debate, and I make that comparison because Peter's anti-debate wasn't that structured and it wasn't that helpful. And Jordan showed up totally unprepared, not reading any of my critiques and sort of being evasive and whatnot. So it was a big disappointment, I think, on all fronts, even my own performance, I can admit. So the Game B thing is again, it's salient because they were against critical race theory way before all of this current news blow up over the past month, right? Jim Rutt specifically. And I'm glad that we were able to sort of bury the hatchet and have a conversation, because as an artifact, it shows what's possible. But again, it shows that nothing's changed. Nothing has changed. Jim was, had James Lindsay on the podcast and was kind of, that's his source for this type of attitude about critical race theory and racism in general. And it's a very reactionary source. And Jim, to this day, sticks to that line, even as news revelations come up and there's not much that can be done about it. So, yeah, I mean, the fact I'm very proud of the encounter, nonetheless. The fact that I took the chance to critique Game B and then reached out to Jim to have a conversation which was dependent on not talking about that critique, right? And so I mentioned that in the show, that would actually be a more interesting, more authentic conversation to have. And so part of my heuristic is to look for these boundaries and edges and kind of push up against them and burrow in, because their idea of a collective intelligence, it's only going to work if we actually recognize the distribution of different skills and knowledge and how they intersect. So there's many things where I would happily defer to these people, and where I would seek building agreements. So I think, Jim claims to be sort of post-capitalist in attitude, right? But his way of going around it is more libertarian and mine is more socialist. So, but there's, most public conversations, this is partly why I don't do very many, but why I criticize others so much is because they're rarely getting to the heart of the issue. They're dancing around it. And
do you think that that's like the low, how do you call it? The easiest fruit to pick. What is it? The lowest hanging fruit. It's just like there's a lot of easy low hanging fruit to go critique, but then it's like to really get to the complex intersectionality of like what it means to live in modernity. Like, well, strap the fuck in, man, because it's going to be a wild ride, And so I guess but then here's my kind of I don't want to say critique of your critique, but like maybe the game. It is to be said, like for me, when I just went back home in Tennessee for a month, so I was back home having a good time, and different cultures and different ways of thinking than out here in LA, than in Europe where we're going, and it's like how we get to cohere. It's like Game B saying it to them is like revolutionary, because it just depends on where you're at, you know, and kind of things. And like, I think we're in these hyper contextualized, like we're on Twitter, everyone's connected, like we're all in this like, you know, hive mind kind of thing, that everything's happening at such point. And it's like, but the game B critique to like the game A, you know, institutions of the past, like mostly gets it right for the layman. But then that's what I'm trying to get at, is like, how much more is it like the law of diminishing returns? Because I understand where you're at, but then it's like, how much more do we need to push to get like, is it a little bit, or are we actually like at the 50% mark and we're not even close? You know what I mean? Like the law of diminishing returns isn't even close, because we're actually halfway and we think we're at 90%. So I think that's one of the ways that we need to kind of cohere and understand, but then at the same time give, I don't know, I don't want to say cursory credit by any means, but like some type of, you know, scale credit. It's like, well, it works up to here, you know, and then if you want to talk about it in this level, well, then we're going to have to kind of switch gears a little bit, you know, much like not to get too technical and scientific, but that's how I think of like how, you know, Einstein and the theory of relativity and like how we see things. It's like, it's not that, you know, that science that he had was wrong. It's just that it's not correct at certain, you know, speeds and temperatures and this like that, you know, it kind of breaks down. So it's not the most correct, but that doesn't just take out the, you know, bowling ball Newtonian mechanics. It just changes it at different places. So I don't know if we want to talk maybe about scales of understanding, consciousness, and then discourse in that way, because, you know, in some of these different things, it's like, this is revolutionary to some people, but then to you and I, if we're talking at a high level, it's like, man, you know, they're really missing the mark completely. And that is a critique. But then some people could just see that critique as, well, maybe, you know, they're just not at the, you know, 100 percentile yet. They're still iterating. They're still making it. So I guess maybe going between those kind of critiques.
Yeah, I think Game B gets a lot right. And so does the Stoa. Like they're trying so hard, and we're all trying so hard, but what it comes down to, I think, like one of the key ideas of a paradigm shift is how you treat anomalies. You know, like datum or whatever that doesn't fit into your theory, right? So I like to be a person who kind of debunks people's working models. Like that's the thing with the Stoa. Like if it doesn't have, or Game B for that matter, if they're really promoting this idea of authenticity and you know, among their basket of concepts, like, but they can't enact them to the point of like not just accommodating what I'm saying, but integrating what I'm saying, right? So they have me on to do a little critiquing, but my critiques don't have the time or the scope to go far enough to catch all the other stuff they're doing, like having Alexander Dugin on to you know, in relatively uncritical ways, just to it helps to promote these different heterodox ideas. And I've lost a lot of patience with the whole idea of heterodox anything, because it's just the opposite of orthodox, right? And really what we're doing is looking at paradox. So paradoxy as opposed to heterodoxy. It's a whole other thing.
So it's not the anti, you're going above it basically, and then seeing it as a whole. So rather than wording one of this way or this way, it's like, well, we need to see the whole thing. And then if you look at it that way, well, they're both right. And that means that it's a paradox. Like, and that's what is kind of messed up with a lot of different things. And that's what I think the paradox of even Jeremy Johnson and I talked about, you know, meta-modernism or even Anthropocene is, the really crazy thing is the paradoxical nature of just the human condition is that, like, we live, like, we're talking online. We're talking in HD, you know, like we have some crazy stuff. We just had a vaccine go through and basically help out there's a lot of different things happening, but then at the same time we have insane inequality. We have like all these, we know that there's fundamentally things wrong. And then it's like, well, how can we, and then people are getting antsy because they know that we can't have our cake and eat it too for too much longer. It's like, it's, you know, you only are playing with house money for so long, you know?
Exactly. That's kind of, you know, hits the nail on the head of why I believe, and I use the word believe whenever I go into this territory, right? Because you have to take a leap of faith, sort of, you know, Matt Christman one of the much smarter guys of the so-called dirtbag left, I still listen to, and he was talking about faith just the other day. So anyways, I use the word believe because I believe that there is, or there has to be, some sort of a tipping point in sociocultural change, a sort of paradigm shift. And so that's what we've been trying to build. It's not going very well, but this idea of a tipping point, like you just touched on it, about how people, realize whether it's the diminishing returns of their current lifestyle or whatever, there's a sense that we're running out of time, and we are running out of time, whether it's the, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, with that, or the UN,
or ecological collapse, with the extinctions of animals and stuff like that. Yeah, for sure.
So I'm constantly surprised that in 2021, with all of the novel projects, that there's not more consilience and not more convergence already. In fact, right. I think in 2021 we have less sort of salience and less coherence than we had during the presidential election cycles. I feel like that window being closed, it is such a hard fact to reckon with, because it was so clearly a mistake. So we're into the Biden administration now,
like the dealing with it, the accountability of our own decisions, and we're still in the wake of that. Yeah. That's an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah. And I can't help but make some comparisons to the MCU and the whole end game saga, because it was, we're living through this time where it's like it feels like the end of the world.
Right.
There's a lot of eschatology, about that, whether it's secular or religious. And so the movies, while being, hyper fictional and hyper real and all these things, it's trying to write its way out of apocalypse, which I find very, very admirable from a writing perspective.
Right. That's an interesting exercise, etc. Yeah,
it's very woke in a good sense. Very, very self-consciously subversive. But anyways, what they, so this is where it gets problematic, because their solution in the film is time travel. Well, we don't have time travel. We don't have that luxury, right? So right. This is literally, like, for through my interpretation, this is the kind of magical realist moment or threshold that you pass through and realize, okay, well, we need something like that, where we like retcon the history of the past 5 years. We don't have time machines. Probably a good thing we don't.
Right. Well, I mean, that I don't know if you mentioned you listened to the Claire Webb podcast, and we were talking about some of the things like the Fermi Paradox and the Drake equation, and one of my favorite kind of like solutions to the Fermi Paradox, if you will, that there's, our universe is very, very old and it's very, very big, but then when we look out to the stars, we don't see anyone. That's the Fermi Paradox. And then the equations say that the alien life should be there, but it's not there. And it's like, well, one of my favorites is, Dan Carlin mentioned, it's like, if you really look at, extra events that could like really mess us up, asteroidal impacts, global warming, run amok, everything. It's like, well, it seems like there's some type of like, great filter, as many have posited, and et cetera. But then it really seems like nowadays it's the, use of technology. And I don't want to get too like ethical, philosophical, but sorta, you know what I mean? It's like the use of it and what we do with it definitely is, done by our environment and what our past and history are, but like it's really up to us, like where we shape it. And then I think one of the big things with that is that Dan Carlin said it's like a pass-fail grade. It's like we basically you either like pass or fail, and by the nature of it being a pass-fail grade, most people fail. And you can just start looking at us, and it's like, well, we're way more down that road than the road of like utopia or like, you know, sentience or whatever the hell you want to call more going towards the abundance direction. It's like we are highway to helling it right now, and everyone is noticing too. So it's not like some secret in it. But then at the same time, we don't really have the collective action. We maybe have the collective intelligence, but we don't have the collective action to like put forward. And that's maybe the biggest critique of intellectualism in general, or, you know, sitting here and talking and not doing, you know, et cetera.
Yeah. I think that's the key. Collective action is a central problematic of sociology, and maybe something I've not spent enough time with, to be honest, because we are so paralyzed. It's like, you know, I always, as a heuristic, advocating going for the exact thing, the exacting diagnosis of the problem, and exacting,
myself included. Yes.
So yeah, collective action. And this is the thing with the election cycle, you know, and it's not, people say it's the American situation is, the American pathology is unique to itself. And I kind of agree with that, but this is all over the world too, just dysfunctional politics. But America is, you know, still a key actor. We can't downplay at all the situation there. And so, yeah, for me, this is what went wrong. Okay. We actually had enough of a majority to win. You know, this is a kind of whatever hypothetical, but let's say that we had the surge, the kind of populist, if you will, energy.
Okay.
But
we saw last year with the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff, like in that kind of vein, if you will.
Well, both elections. So 2016.
Okay. So I see what you're saying.
I'm always talking about both, because
right. You can't separate them.
You can't separate them. It was this big deja vu moment. Like the 2020 election was very much a rehash of the 2016 unresolved tension.
Yeah.
And this is the key reason I was so against the IDW, because they literally like sucked up all of the attention span for political discourse, period. It's like, oh, Sam Harris this, Eric Weinstein that. And never were they saying anything really useful or substantive or original for somebody who's been through those schools of thought, you know, who's been, whether it's been through Marxism or been through New Atheism.
Yes.
You know, and not only like, you know, so many things went wrong, right? I think the left failed to develop a holistic immune response, right? Hundreds of articles and dunking videos went after the IDW, and I felt very validated in my own critiques, because a lot of us were saying very similar things, like, and a lot of it, like we've already discussed, it boiled down to the fact that like Peterson hadn't read Marx. So why are we even talking about this? Right. There's a kind of,
this is a non-starter
frustration there. Is exactly. It's a non-starter. And so look at how many non-starters and nothing burgers take off and get steam in the public discourse. And,
or even the recent IRS, you know, secret IRS files. Then the first thing that's happening is not to go, you know, after the structure or critique the framework or get bills done. It's like, wait, who whistle blew this? You know what I mean? Like, yeah, you know what I mean? Like, and then we're going to come out with the fullest extent of the law. And it's like, wait a second. This is the same, you know, conversation we had about like leaked materials. You know, this is like Snowden and like all that other stuff rehashed in another way and in different actors. You know, but it's the same conclusion. You know, like
Snowden is still a sort of refugee. You know, he's still what do you call it when someone's on the run?
Oh, asylum seeker.
That too. I think there's another word, like he's
diplomatic. I see what you're saying. Yeah, there's some like term for it.
Yeah, and it's the same with Assange, and you know, it's,
sure.
It's unfortunate because the Assange thing has become very partisan, right? Where a lot of lefties have just sort of given up, and a lot of right wingers have taken over that free Assange kind of theme, and I'm not shy about it. Like I'll say like free Assange and, you know, free Palestine and free Britney, you know,
sure. Right.
All in the same sentence.
Nailed it.
but what I'm saying is the left collectively failed to cohere because there was various minor things that could have in Bernie's campaign or in the leftist mobilization that could have been done different, and it's hard to say what would have worked. I like to say that I think Bernie should have run third party. I could be completely wrong on that. My analysis could be off. It could have been pointless and whatever. And maybe this is the best of all possible timelines where Bernie became part of the Biden movement to some degree, and Bernie himself is content with where things are at, and has a high level position as a budget committee. But more importantly than the left's failure, because that's such a dead horse, I think it's an important conversation to have, and to constantly own our mistakes and own our dubiousness for different narratives. The main failures came from conservatives and liberals in the center, right? And so because we had an opportunity, granted that things like the Green New Deal were imperfect, right? But we had a narrative opportunity for collective action to come back to that term, right? And to actively build consensus again, even though it's imperfect. And so many people, the circles I was in, were either secretly pro-Bernie or apathetic or just too involved in other things outside of political discourse to get roped into that messiness. And I say that was exactly the wrong move to eschew the political participation and to eschew being a public intellectual, all the things that those roles entail. Because as far as I'm concerned, all of the good guidance and strategy and sort of prefigurative political work to prepare us for that moment, it's already been done. 2016 was not the time to jump on the anti-SJW bandwagon.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
It's absolutely not the time, to fuck around. And that's exactly what happened.
Because there's like some different scales. Like even though your critique maybe at some level, it's like we're at this meta narrative that is really more impactful to our lives, to our thing, which is kind of summarizing up or emerging up as the hyper object of the 2016 and 2020 election. Because again, that pulled in, and how many resources and narratives and stuff did that have its own life of its own? Sorry.
Yeah. And there's limitless factors we could point to, but one that just popped into my head is probably one of the biggest kind of categorical failures. And so it's what Hillary Clinton did. and I single her out just to say that everybody was doing something similar, which was some sort of strategic, consultant informed.
Oh, the Piper strategy?
Yes, that's exactly what I was
getting. This all went down straight to shit after this.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is like Hillary was playing a particular game strategy, but she wasn't the only one. Everybody was doing this, right? So the media and the deep state, if you will, we're all playing this sort of game. And everybody's plans backfired and blew up in their faces with the Trump election. And then for 4 years, you have, liberals saying, oh, nobody saw this coming, even though it was leftists who sort of warned and predicted and advised in a much better direction, right? And then you even have Trump himself later in, when by the time Bernie had dropped out and Biden was the nominee, you have Trump saying like, well, it's a good thing they didn't put Bernie up against,
because then he would have lost even worse, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, wait, what? How did you just make that connection right there? Yeah.
Yeah. And so the election was so close, right? And you have Biden scraping by to win. But then what? Then it's back to the Obama neoliberal status quo, right? And so we're kind of all collectively gaslit about that. And then, so when we get to this point of analysis, right, you'd think that we could all start to come together again, that the IDW doesn't like Biden. I don't like Biden, right? So why
Yeah,
can't we converge around that point? But we can't, because like I said before, the things that they're talking about are not about the actual thing. And that's what it come to this term like dog whistles, right? Dog whistles, dog whistles galore. And it's not the best label, because
well, sleight of hand is an easier one for me, I
Mm.
think, because it's like it focuses your attention. It's like that's the oldest trick in the book. That is focus your attention over here while we do something over here, you know. And then that right there is dog whistling in a sense that like it projects and kind of shows where you're going, but then it's like it takes the wrong conclusion, you know.
Yeah, and if I could try to connect this logic and this thread with my idea of systemic conspiracy.
Oh,
I
against collective action or anything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The idea of systemic conspiracy is that almost all of us are captured by something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't need to imply malice or even like complacency.
No, it could be literally just the runnings of like the bureaucracy of something, or the inner workings and the plumbing of like some type of system. Yeah, it could be as benign as that.
And the literature, just quickly, the conspiracism academic literature basically showed three kind of waves, right? The first, second, and third waves had a different approach to conspiracy itself, and you still see all of these waves active today. But it's really the third wave that interested me, because it contained the two previous movements. And just like feminism, right? It goes through different waves, but the third wave is really more of a systemic critique. It's when the critiques aren't directed at, individuals. So there's not necessarily an individual guilt or implication, so you can no longer point to Obama or George Bush or Bill Clinton or whoever.
The agency is lost, right?
Or their puppeteers. But I kind of nor can you solve the conspiracy theory itself, right? So things like JFK, 9/11, those remain relatively unresolved to this day, in the sense that there's a lot of nut job conspiracy theorizing, tinfoil hat, whatever. But my goal is not to completely dismiss and disparage that, but more specifically that even with the sort of so-called good conspiracy theorizing, you don't get any closer.
Right.
So the IDW has been doing a lot of that conspiracy theorizing, whether it's about their own suppression, they think they're suppressed even though they have huge platforms, or whether it's about COVID vaccines and different treatments.
Yep.
Not having a medical background, I can say with confidence that that's not going to go anywhere, because it's in the realm of conspiracy theory. But what I'm trying to get at with the kind of third wave and the systemic critique is for everybody to have a better literacy and understanding of where they are in the system, because the system is so overdetermined, so reified, like, this is water, as David Foster Wallace would say. Like it's all
okay. Yeah. Love that.
It's mediated by technology, by language, by different metaphysical systems. And so, that's why I'm coming back to this point about Hillary Clinton. Like she was following some protocols, as were her colleagues, as were everybody, except
like a script. Yeah, she's just following a script.
Yeah, and the script is very well funded, very well. It's part of a broader schemes of control, but it's self-legitimating, but. They haven't owned the fact that their strategy did not work, right? So Hillary Clinton comes out with a book after, like, I think it's called What Happened or something like that.
Right.
It's
like it's more like you feign ignorance, or they put it on this or that, and it's like not owning the
exactly. And so that doesn't impress anybody who's serious about critique and about politics. We really want to see. We really want to see a kind of metanoia, kind of owning of one, an atoning of one's fuck ups. So yeah, but coming back to the IDW, there's a massive failure to engage in good faith, despite that's what they claim to be about, right? And you still have a lot of IDW fans who are like, oh, they really opened my eyes in civil debate, and they're so reasonable. But if we drill down into that argument, it doesn't really hold up, and maybe it doesn't hold up for any of us, like as the Crowder versus Cedar thing kind of showed, right? We're reproducing the kind of conspiracy against ourselves. This is a kind of macro history approach, because there's a lot of good H.G. Wells wrote The Open Conspiracy, and it's a really good book, just basically saying, like, history unfolds kind of as a conspiracy. Right. So we might as well openly conspire to make it better. And
that's a good way to put it, because the other oldest trick in the book is divide and conquer, and it's like that you can really see that when you start thinking about collective action in the sense of as a framework of knowledge, but then also participatory, like being in the world. And then the fact that collective action throughout history, you know what I mean? Like, yes, there's a lot of collective action that gets to the point of maybe, like nationalism, Nazi Germanism going crazy. But at a whole, collective action is really like stamped down, any type of things like that, because, it's, you're dividing and you're conquering, so you can deal with lesser units of influence, et cetera. But then now it really seems like it's like what you had used, a post-truth era. It's really supercharged. And then I don't even want to say the supercharging of the 2016-2020 election that we kind of agreed that is one full thing. But then you could even argue that, like, after COVID now, and as you were just talking, I was thinking about how, like, the difference of IDW, Game B, all these other things would have happened with the extension of, like, in real life. You know what I mean? Like, because the Peterson Zizek, like, debate was in real life. They were together, and it's like you're not going to start talking shit. But then Steven Crowder, he'll just start mouthing off on social media, et cetera, because he's really not going to meet these people in person. And so I'm trying to think of like how this kind of discourse, now that we're coming into in real life, that after 18 months, now it's like, which way is that going to go? Is it going to be really intense, or is this maybe the opportunity to take in some of the best things of technology and then in real life, because and put them together, because it's like, I think one of the biggest things about the critiques, I talked to Vinay Gupta when we went to London, and one of his things that he had mentioned was, we should really do some stuff like in-person events. And so now we really, after COVID, are going to try and do that, because it's like, well, it'd be great to like do an eclectic spacewalk kind of like little meet up, we cohere, we talk, we dialogue or whatever, but then there's opportunity to like meet, in person and go skydiving, do something fun, like maybe not that, but it's like it could be as much as tapas, and so if more and more of these communities are more and more honest, but then and keep moving into their collective action, I think there is some types of possibility of not utopian thinking, but more of in a progressive light. And then moving in that direction, I think is going to be interesting now that like vaccines are out, restrictions are open. So I don't know if you have some type of maybe what's going to be in the future with the in real life kind of stuff, and then if that, what we kind of can see in that.
Yeah. Well, I don't want this to sound like callous, but I think like, the expression talk is cheap. And I kind of feel the same about in real life stuff. Like, obviously we all need some sort of, real kind of physical socialization.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. It might get too conferencey.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I'm not trying to say that. Yeah, good point.
So part of the issue here is that there, before the pandemic, there was already a lot of in-person stuff, and it makes no difference. It's like
right. That's
people
a
are
good
still
point.
missing the forest for the trees sort of thing. So I'm skeptical about sort of any kind of reductionist modalities that are let's do this. Yeah. And I feel like the Stoa is doing a lot of that. I'm not saying I'm against it. Like, by all means, go for tapas and go to escape rooms or whatever, build solidarity. But yeah, it leaves much to be desired in terms of where is the, the real conversion practice? So there's a lot of conversational practice, to the point almost where it's fetishized, but where is the conversion practice? And, where are we telling those stories?
Not just the convergence of these different ideas, modalities of thinking, everything, but it's like, okay, well, what is the goal? I think maybe the thing that we keep coming down to. It's like, well, the goal is transitory. It depends on what we're asking, it's contextual and stuff. And so if you put this kind of like, open-ended question, well then you got a million and infinity of open-ended answers, and it's like, and we're no closer to convergence or conversion or coherence than we really were when we started off.
Yeah, and I'm all for conferences and workshops and whatever that are working towards these goals, so long as they're doing it to an extent, they're really pushing boundaries and achieving something, rather than it just being like therapeutic or some kind of like entertainment value. So yeah, like there's always this tension between like solving our personal problems and solving the world's problems. And I'm trying to say, like, there doesn't have to be that tension.
Right. Yes. Good point.
This is precisely why, like, I'll engage any type of talk about the IDW or with the IDW, but I will not accept their premises the framing of, how we approach problem solving and dialogue.
Well, I think people see that being critical, a critique, as then now, like, you've pushed beyond some type of element. Now it's like being critical is takes on a mind of its own, in like accountability, or you are responsible, or things like that. And it's like, there's some there, but like being critical is almost the foundation of like how, I don't know, like this all came to be. Like, I don't think we get there by not being critical. And it seems like the more critical we are, then the quicker we get to the truth, and the quicker we get to understanding our own biases about even going down those roads to figure out what truth is. Because you could argue that cyclical journey into what is truth until the cows come home. But I think maybe one of the things, maybe the segue into more to the tangible things, is to talk about, lastly, because we, maybe about 10 more minutes, is talk about your organization, or the Abs-Tract Organization. So the Abs-Tract Organization is a meta think tank formed to provide global solutions to systemic problems, specializing in, quote, abstraction, an advanced thinking process and social critique with wide-ranging applications. So I think like what you're doing is an example of that. Like, we're trying to cohere, and then maybe we're just not there yet. You have kind of had some experience with think tanks, lobbying, etc. So maybe let's just set the stage about what Abs-Tract Organization is trying to do, and then maybe we do thread that needle about how we go from theory to practice, because again, like, money is politics, etc., and like even if it's not successful now, maybe we are putting the groundwork into like what could be moving forward in a different paradigm shift. So maybe just introduce it a little bit, and then we can get into what abstraction is, and then kind of how we can take that theories and then put them into practice, because this collective action, I think, is the through line that we can kind of keep running with, that our viewers and then you and I have been more on for this conversation, at least.
Yeah, I think where to begin. So the project has evolved a lot. It's changed from its formative version and ideals. Not a whole lot, but I'll explain what I mean by that, because I kind of drew up the plans for it, but never got funding, right? So it's always been kind of just a part-time kind of passion project. And really, I don't know, what would have been different, and if I had got funding. I definitely wanted to produce a lot of like educational content, and the internet is saturated with that. You just have to know where to look for it, right? So because of lack of resources, but also just other things happening, I decided not to follow through with my sort of agenda, right? So, but the reason I formed it and branded it the way I did was recognizing, the kind of paralysis of think tanks, the captured nature of think tanks, which at that point was like becoming well known, right? Like well established that think tanks were regularly producing very biased, very selective kind of work. And that on the whole, with over 7,000 think tanks in the whole world, there wasn't anything really connecting them. And so I was always interested, and there's some great, my Anti-Intellectualism article, I open up with a kind of prologue about think tanks, because there's a great there's a great resource there that I pointed to that maps out what think tanks are, how they exist between academia and the private sector and media and government and all these things. And so I always aspired to be in those spaces, but then, progressively throughout my whole life, my kind of naivete was stripped away, that these institutions are very high in abstraction, but very low in many cases in kind of veracity or ethics.
Sure. Yeah,
right?
that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
To the point where you have think tanks that only exist to produce anti-climate propaganda,
merchants of doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So my original plan was really this focus on abstraction, because I noticed how many different things it meant, and yet how fundamental it was, as a cognitive process, but as something that works throughout history and is history to some extent. You can examine the relationship between kind of intellectual history and paradigms and for better or worse, right, into obviously imperialism and colonialism, slavery, all this sort of stuff, war. So, the meta-modern thing is to try to synthesize everything from ancient wisdom to futurist kind of aspirations and, make it real in the present and psychoactive and transformative. And so anyways, I've blabbed on a lot without saying more about abstraction, because that's really the key. That's what it always comes back to. And that's an ongoing project. I don't have a conclusive answer yet. I've written about a dozen articles on abstraction, different types, but it goes into money, MMT again, the aesthetics, pop culture, kind of all that abstraction. And
yeah, here I'll read something just so we can get it on the docket or the
perfect.
Yeah. So abstraction is a conceptual process of complexity reduction that highlights the essential properties or first principles of a given object or idea and analysis across different layers, levels. The process has limitless instantiations throughout many fields, including math, computer science, linguistics, neuroscience, psychology, but most importantly, philosophy, social theory, and artificial intelligence. So that right there is a very interesting way. It's a framework kind of how to view things or a lens, how to see it. But based on the level of abstraction of that lens, how your movie kind of put it, it can get pretty interesting in terms of analysis. But then as soon as you start analyzing, then you start seeing how the multiplicative effect of how everything's kind of ingrained together. Everything's interconnected and stuff.
Yeah, and I've had some insights that have been fleeting and hard to capture, right? So I've tried to capture some insight into whatever I write and produce and put out there, because it doesn't stay in my mind, and I think that's
right.
That's part of the problematic of doing social philosophy, is that we can't all be, Chomsky or Foucault, or Chomsky versus Foucault. We're in an age where, and maybe we've always sort of been here, but where the intellectual problem is so complex, it can only be solved collectively, right? So we don't need another monograph from such and such academic, right? That serves a very niche function. But what we really need to do is to have a kind of concerted collective action by millions of people in strategic positions, right? Even if it's just all of those people pressing the same button at the same time.
It needs to happen.
Maybe it needs to be that simple for people, because otherwise they don't know how to coordinate.
Well, and that's a good way to put it in the operating manual of Spaceship Earth. You know, Buckminster Fuller, Jeremy Johnson and I talked about that too. It's like, you know, the Russians are at the flight controls, the Americans are at the navigation, the Chinese are at the boot, you know, like cargo stuff, and it's like no one knows what's going on, you know. But then I wrote an essay called, there was like updated operating manual for Spaceship Earth, and it was about like, it's not going to be one book like this top down thing. It's going to be this kind of collective, like thousands upon thousands of like indigenous cultures, your culture, my culture, everyone's, you know, geographic thing, intellectual, and then it's going to come up, and then that's the operating manual for Spaceship Earth. But really, like you said, the only truism, I guess you could say, out of all that is that it only is going to happen if we do it together. And that's like that African proverb, you know, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together, you know. And it's like, well, we're going really fucking fast, you know what I mean? And it's like, depending on how far we go is, you know, based on that, like how together are we, how collective are we, you know, kind of deal.
Yeah. So I'm constantly disappointed at what I'm seeing in the world, you know, the failure of leftists to converge and consolidate, but especially the failure of everybody else. So yes, I'm hypercritical, which includes criticism of the political left, but only because we're in a so deeply, you know, layered, you know, multi-textured problem.
Yeah, it's more like a labyrinth. You know what I mean? It's not necessarily even like a maze. A maze is enough for like a labyrinth. Like there are many dead ends, trapdoors, you know, forces at B that don't want you to finish, you know, et cetera.
Yeah. So I tried to pick a project that was way beyond me and that was like impossible for me to fulfill, to actualize, and also hard for people to get, unfortunately, you know.
Well, I hope you're okay with failure then, because like you're gonna be learning a lot. Because I think that's any critique of critics. You know, it's like I really enjoy like your commentary, a lot of the other commentary, because it makes me think. But then at the same time, it's like, what is the next level? You know what I mean? Like, what is beyond critiquing? You know, we need to get like do it. You know, and it's like I think that you have kind of reached that limit of social commentary and writing and stuff like that. Of like, well, we either need to kind of come together, or a lot of these things are, you know, going to end up go from bad to worse. You think now is bad, you know. And it was like there was a meme I saw that was like the Bart Simpson thing. It was like, this is going to be the hottest summer of our lives, and then Homer Simpson's like sitting there and he's like, on the contrary, this is going to be the coldest summer of our life, or the you know, the hottest or the coldest hottest summer of our lives. You know what I mean? So there's always like this little through line that you can take from it. But cool. Yeah, so lastly, I'll just ask you like one last question. I ask everyone this. You know, so the overview effect is when astronauts see the Earth from outer space. Only like 5 or 600 out of 10 billion humans that have kind of ever lived in 200,000 years have actually seen that, experienced that. And I think we've had a lot of through lines about what you would say if like, you know, you could talk to the world, or the world was looking at you and stuff. But it doesn't have to be as proselytizing, but like I do want to give a opportunity for people, especially like what is your kind of message? I don't want to say as a message, but what would you want other people to think about? You know, what would you want people to trip over their own truths? Obviously, we just spent an hour and a half, so you have a lot. People can trip over a lot of their truths for this, but maybe one kind of parting message if you want to say to finish up.
Yeah, I thought about this after watching your last interview, and it's a bit tongue in cheek, but my answer would be something like, "You fucking idiots!" Like, just looking down on the people of Earth, like, and I'm one of those people, right? But just like, it's like the Charlton Heston Planet of the Apes thing. Is like, you blew it up.
Oh, right.
You know, it's like,
you did it. Yeah. I get you.
Yeah. And you know, there's a documentary, right? I think it's just called The Overview Effects. Like, is it like half an hour? Yeah. So I saw that years ago.
I think they made it into a thing called Planetary. I think is the full length film. If you want to check that out.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen that.
Yeah.
I saw a screening in Vancouver, and part of me was like, oh, this is amazing. Like, it's going to change people's minds. And And then part of me was also like, you know, I already felt this way. I already, like most people, had kind of astronaut fantasies and
Of course.
you know, or even just looking at documentaries, you know, Carl Sagan, just, you know, we
Yep.
had it in the zeitgeist in our lifetimes already.
Yep.
So just that type of planetary consciousness. So I'd want to just foreground that, just like,
Yeah.
but it doesn't, you know, if you follow through, it doesn't lead. This is the thing, right? Again, like we're all being branched off into different projects and timelines, and that's not how it should be.
Right.
That's not to say I have the totalistic authoritarian plan that we all need to follow, but we, you know, first and foremost, we need to create the conditions for health and prosperity for everybody.
Sure.
That's something that big state actors and activists could converge on and.
Mm-hmm.
You know, make that a reality. Because yeah, again, it's like certain conditions have to be met, like healthcare, and this is a thing that gets axed on the altar of public discourse every time. You know.
Oh yeah, and then, but then, like you said, like they're almost gaslighting or using dog whistles by saying that we can't do it, but then understanding fundamentally that if they did that, then their health, like the global health, like if we, and it's not as easy as you know, a rising tide lifts all ships, but it sort of is in the same way as thinking about it as what's possible. And I don't know how much of, like, you know, we want to put on our doomer optimist hats. That's another, you know, side of Twitter that has kind of emerged as like an interesting little grouping of, you know, doomer optimists. Like, we know the world is fucking coming to an end. What better, you know, opportunity to make it fucking awesome, you know, because it's going to shit. Like, and so I guess that echoing your thing of you fucking idiots, and I guess last thing for me before you can kind of give the last word is there was this great TikTok, I loved it, and it was basically about like Earth sending an application into like the planetary, you know, League of Congress or something like that, and there's a person sitting there like, okay, you know, is everyone fed or whatever? Yeah. And they're like, no. Oh, that's not good. You know, and then it's like, they just goes down the list, and the entire time you're just like, God, we suck, dude. You know what I mean? Like, to aliens or to whoever, like, that's probably why the Fermi Paradox, it's like, we're not interesting enough. We're still, you know, idiot apes, you know, throwing rockets at each other, you know, still trying to figure out, you know, nonsense things when we could be doing the most extraordinary things, but we're not because of systemic conspiracy or all these other things. And then, but collective action seems like, you know, and collective convergence, planetary governance, but not planetary government, you know, so that kind of stuff, is within our line of thinking and is within the possibility. So I don't know if you want to have a final word, on that.
Yeah, sure. Just, I'll just, you know, I make references to Benjamin Bratton a lot and his project at Strelka Institute, and their most recent kind of symposium was called For Planetary Governance. And that's that sort of movement or school of thought I've tracked for a while now, you know, at least since 2013. But there's a lot of explicit abstraction. There's a lot of just lucid articulation of the problem, right? And so you need that kind of high level analysis, but it needs to also be, you know, very, very, very collaborative with democratic movements. And I guess my final thought is, I think we're also exhausted from failing and all these things, from trying so hard. Good like point. we need to settle. Not like settle for, but we need to settle on a kind of global vision that is easier to communicate and is appealing to everybody. And so there's certain things that are inevitable about globalization because it's like a function of population growth. You know, a lot of things just happen. But you know, when we look at our big maps behind us, we just need to get more and more real about framing a politics that is honest. Like one of my slogans for the Abs-Tract Organization, I came up with about a dozen, but one of them, as it pertains to this point, was honesty is the best public policy.
Yeah.
Because it's like a play on that phrase, right?
Yep. Yep.
And so, yeah, we need to use the tired phrase, we need to fucking cancel a lot of people. We really do. I mean, just like, but really my preference would be if they just resigned, if they if they came to the conclusion on their own, oh shit, I really fucked up. Like if Charles Murray was like, oh shit, I've been, writing about IQ and race for 30 years and I've been wrong the whole time. He could just do an about face on his own. People have to go after him. So I pray that those sorts of things happen, because we can do better. We can do better. We got to start believing in the same right things that will produce and will pay off in our lifetimes.
Awesome. Yeah, that's resounding yes all around for a lot of that. And but then maybe the next conversation we have, or the next discussion, is more along the lines of that, like mental ruts and getting into, again, the biological or the thinkings and stuff like that. So but Brent, that's all the time we have today, so I just want to thank you so much for coming on conversations with us. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Cool. Well, okay, until next time, ad astra.